Well, thanks to the subscribers of the Enigma channel, we were able to find and purchase a Mercedes S-Class. It's an S280. It's exactly the same model and exactly the same year of manufacture as the car involved in the crash. The only difference with this car is that the steering wheel is on the opposite side because this is a British version. But apart from that, this is exactly the same vehicle. Now, we've had this car for nearly 2 years. We've been able to do a lot of driving tests. We've gone through the tunnel many times in this car, and it's given me a lot of insights, and I've never seen a documentary where they've gone to the trouble of actually purchasing an S-Class for the research in the actual film. This car cost €100,000 new. That's about £76,000, I think, roughly. It's bought by dictators, VIPs, footballers' wives, prime ministers, anyone who wants a rugged, sturdy vehicle. The build quality is the best that Mercedes have to offer. There is nothing above the S-Class apart from the Maybach, which is a different company which is run by Mercedes altogether. The general build quality of this car exceeds what you would find in a Bentley and also in a Rolls-Royce. The doors have a self-closing mechanism. This really creates a hermetic seal around the door frame, and this adds to the rigidity of the framework of the actual car. And there is an interesting sequence in a film starring George Clooney called The Peacemaker, where they take a Mercedes S-Class, exactly the same car as this, and they punish the car incredibly, and you can see that in the car it stands up to a huge amount of abuse. And the storyline in the plot of the Peacemaker film is that the S-Class is being used by special operatives, by intelligence agents.
Oh shit!
Reach into that briefcase, pull out an extra magazine.
Where is it?
In the briefcase, reach it.
God damn it!
Seatbelt.
What are you doing?
Well, what I have to say after spending nearly 2 years driving this car is that you do need some experience to handle a car of this size. Many of my friends have taken it for a spin, and they've been absolutely gobsmacked at the huge size of this vehicle. It's difficult to judge gaps, it's difficult to park, it's difficult to get into a garage, and in my investigation I've been unable to ascertain whether Henri Paul had experience of driving the S-Class Mercedes. What I can say is that the car that was in the crash was supplied by an organisation called Étoile Limousines, and Étoile Limousines have had a very close working relationship with the Ritz Hotel. On the night of the crash, apparently, this is according to certain reports which I've read and researched, on the night of the crash, the Mercedes S280 limousine in question was the only car available to ferry Dodi and Diana to Dodi's apartment. And it's interesting because you would imagine that there would be other cars available, but apparently it was this one, this S280, which was the only one which was available. Well, many people have sort of speculated that the Mercedes was tampered with and rigged in some way. And in parts of this film we discuss the so-called Boston brakes method, which was developed by certain people working for the SAS. So, you know, this was another reason why I took the decision to purchase an exact model so that we could do our own tests. And we looked under the hood and we found some interesting things. Now, many of the mechanisms in this car are all controlled electronically by an engine management system and an electronics management system. And I have it on good authority from experienced Mercedes mechanics that you could modify this car, in actual fact you can modify any car, using hydraulically controlled piston rods attached to the steering assembly, and then by the use of remote control technology, which you find on model aeroplanes and model racing cars, you can control the hydraulic piston rods, but they would have to have their own additional power source, or you would have to suck power from the existing battery in the car. Whatever modification you wanted in terms of being able to remotely control the steering and the brakes of a car, you would have to drill into parts of the car and you would have to add extra control rods. As far as I've been told, it's not possible to control the actual existing electronic system remotely without having some kind of physical modification. So when we purchased this car, we did an internal inspection, and immediately what struck us is that the whole engine layout is very, very logical and extremely clear. Here you have your water supply, the battery, the radiator is all in an enclosed enclosure. There's not that many wires dangling around. The hoses are all moulded in their own separate enclosures. In actual fact, everything here, the covers for the lights, they have little light emblems so that you know that this is how you change the bulb. This is the water windscreen wiper fluid filler, and you can see that there are emblems all over the car. Things are clearly marked. There's labels telling you what everything is, and it's interesting that Mercedes engineers were refused, point blankly refused, access to inspect the wreckage of the car which was carrying Diana. And I believe that's because if you were to drill any new parts into this engine, if you were to add anything at all, an experienced Mercedes engineer would immediately be able to detect that there'd been a modification. And even somebody without any specialist Mercedes mechanical training would be able to tell that these specifically designed components, which are all constructed and laid out in a very, very logical manner, even somebody with a mild amount of mechanical knowledge would be able to detect a part which should not be there. And that is why I believe that Mercedes engineers have been refused access to the wreckage to this day. And their offer was refused immediately after the crash, and still for the last 10 years the wreck has not been given over to Mercedes. Well, I've driven this Mercedes for nearly 2 years, and when I saw the photographs of the crash blown up so that we could really analyse the wreckage as it was photographed by the world's media as it sat in the tunnel before it got whisked away, I just found it difficult to believe that the metalwork, the very, very thick metalwork that this car is made of, would just fold up like a crisp packet. I mean, there's obviously a very big difference between this S-Class Mercedes and something like a Renault Twingo. And the reason that people pay a lot of money for, you know, the S-Class Mercedes and Range Rovers and Bentleys is because they want a lot of, you know, robust construction around them as they're driving. People pick these cars for the safety aspect. And my feeling is that the Mercedes was weakened. I feel that the structure of the Mercedes was probably partly drilled, partly sawn through across the roof section and across the bonnet area there, and that I don't believe that the impact was, you know, 100 miles an hour or 100 kilometers an hour even. I think that the impact probably took place when the car was running at maybe 45, 50, 55, 60 miles an hour maximum. Now we do know that the Mercedes was stolen several weeks before, and that if you know, the various reports vary that you read, but apparently one of the doors was removed, and the microchip which manages the electronics for the engine system was also taken, was also stolen. Well, those chips can be bought on eBay, and various Mercedes parts companies make those chips available. It has a retail value of about £120. Now, it makes you wonder why somebody would bother stealing the car at gunpoint while there was somebody driving the car in the centre of Paris just to steal a £120 microchip, which they could buy from eBay. Well, I'm actually sitting in the same position that Diana sat in when she left in the Mercedes from the rear entrance of the Ritz Hotel. And according to the official Lord Stevens report, the seatbelt was jammed in the retracted position. Now, this is a luxury vehicle, and the seatbelts are actually tailored and have their own conduits which they travel in. And I find it impossible to believe that the seatbelt was jammed by pure accident. My feeling is that this is a highly engineered vehicle, and that somebody tampered with the mechanics of the vehicle, and also they deliberately jammed the seatbelt. In actual fact, right up until the moment of impact with the 13th pillar, no one in the car was wearing a seatbelt. Apparently, Trevor Rees-Jones may have used his seatbelt at the last minute, allegedly. And unfortunately, Trevor Rees-Jones has been, really not a good resource of information about what was going on in the Mercedes. There is one comment which alleges that he said once that he doesn't remember much about the journey in the Mercedes, and he hopes that he never does remember. So we had 4 occupants. You had Henri Paul at the wheel.
Yeah.
He didn't have a seatbelt.
No.
Trevor Rees-Jones sitting next to Henri Paul in the front passenger seat, and he didn't have a seatbelt on.
No, the stories up until very recently were that Trevor Rees-Jones was the only person wearing a seatbelt at the point of impact. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt all the way through the journey. We knew that because that's standard bodyguard procedure anyway. He shouldn't have been wearing a seatbelt. But the stories until recently were that in the last few moments before the crash, he managed to get his seatbelt on, and he was the only one wearing a seatbelt. Thus, he was the only survivor. Mm-hmm. But actually, it's come out in the report again that even Trevor Rees-Jones wasn't wearing a seatbelt. So nobody was wearing a seatbelt in that car.
And you can clearly see Dodie
Indeed.
is leaning over, presumably looking out the window at the motorcycle paparazzi. Now, if he did have a seatbelt on, he wouldn't even be able to lean over that far.
No, indeed.
Okay, so the only sole survivor. Shall we talk a little bit about Trevor Rees-Jones?
Trevor Rees-Jones.
What's Trevor Rees-Jones' background?
Well, he came from the elite parachute regiment. We know that much, and he joined Mohammed Al Fayed's security staff on leaving the paras. Mm-hmm. And he was one of Mohammed Al Fayed's security staff on the night of the crash.
Now the paras are sort of known as a kind of elite kind
they
of.
They are an elite, one notch below perhaps the SAS. You know, they're the elite of the actual army. Yeah, for sure.
Now, is it true that Trevor Rees-Jones says that he remembers nothing?
Yeah, it's true that he says it. Well, he's had a couple of flashbacks, but it might as well be nothing. He remembers being followed by a motorbike, he said. One or two little bits, but irrelevant, really. He remembers virtually nothing, yeah.
Now, there's a book that's been published that carries Trevor Rees-Jones's name on the front cover.
Yeah.
But it actually, the authorship is actually attributed to another person.
Yeah.
Now, I've read that book, and one of the interesting things is that out of the very, very tiny fragments that he does remember, he does actually say that if Henri Paul was speeding at a ridiculous speed, he would have said to Henri Paul, "I think you're going a bit too fast." And
Absolutely.
according to Trevor Rees-Jones, that car was not going as fast as the mainstream media told us. So could you just sort of tell us what this whole situation was with the speedometer and the speed?
I mean, it's interesting because, Trevor Rees-Jones has said that. He said if he'd have noticed similarly about Henri Paul's alleged inebriated state, he would have noticed and he would have said, these are trained bodyguards, they're trained to observe people's behaviour.
Yes.
Whether they've been drinking, whether they haven't, whether they're driving too fast. guy was driving the Princess of Wales, and Dodie, who was Trevor Rees-Jones' personal charge that night. So he would have noticed, and he would have got on Henri Paul's case if he was driving recklessly or too fast. But with regard to, what was the other question that you were saying there?
The speedometer.
The speedometer, that's right. The stories that came out immediately after the crash, virtually the next day, plastered all over the British press anyway, was that the speedometer had been stuck. It jammed on 192 kilometres per hour on impact. Now, Mercedes...
That's very fast.
Well, it's very fast anyway, but that's a fact. And but nonetheless, Mercedes cars are made in such a way that the speedometer always reverts to zero. It never jams on 192 or it never jams at any particular speed. It reverts to zero on impact. It's like the airbags coming out. An impact will send the speedometer back to zero. And again, with Lord Stevens' report, we've now we've found discovered that indeed it did revert to zero. So this whole story of the speed of the car being the speedometer, yeah, exactly. It was all planned to show, I believe, to show the evidence suggests that was the media ploy to create this character of Henri Paul. He was drunk, he was driving way too fast. Look how fast he was going. The speedometer stuck on that speed that he was doing. Yes. It's nonsense.
It's nonsense, and we know that that's not true, mainly due to the things that Trevor Rees-Jones has remembered. He remembers that Henri Paul was, just acting normally.
Yeah.
There's never been a suggestion from Trevor Rees-Jones that Henri Paul was drunk.
Absolutely, not quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. He's made it very, very clear that had Henri Paul been in any way drunk or incapable, there is no way, and not just Trevor Rees-Jones. Trevor Rees-Jones' partner on that night, Kes Wingfield, the other bodyguard.
Yes.
Both were in the bar with Henri Paul in the hotel lobby. They were with him all evening once Henri Paul returned back to the Ritz Hotel. For the 2 hours prior to the crash, both of them have said quite clearly, if we thought at any time Henri Paul had been incapable through drink, we would not have let him get behind the car, behind the wheel of the car.
Mr. Alpine, what do you think of the revelations in today's Daily Mirror that in fact Diana thought that Prince Charles was trying to have her killed?
Yeah, but I'm always saying this from the beginning. That is the head of the royal family. And I suspect not only Prince Charles, but without Prince Philip, who is racist at the core.
What evidence do you have for that, Mr. Alpine? There's a damning allegation.
No, but I'm saying it, I'm not worried. I'm saying it all the time, from the beginning.
But what evidence do you have for that?
The evidence is already been detailed in the application which I made in traditional review in Scotland. Right?
Can you tell
Most people, like 99% of authors, when they put a book together, they have, a goal or several goals in mind. What would you like to see happen now that this evidence has come out into the open now through your books?
Well, I mean, the actual book is calling for a public inquiry, an investigation, open investigation into what led up to the crash and what went on at the actual crash scene.
So you'd like a kind of staged or televised thing that all the members of the public could actually watch as it was going on?
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of the key players involved in what we're saying was an assassination.
There's so much of this evidence is discredited and dismissed, as conspiracy theory, that nice neat little phrase that they've made up and thrown out through the media into the public domain, conspiracy theory or conspiracy theorist. And there's a lot of evidence there that's just not being looked at. It certainly hasn't been, given a fair crack of the whip. There's a lot of questions still unanswered, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Diana was assassinated.
So I think the people have got a right to an inquiry. And during research and writing of the book, we came across, a huge number of people. I mean, I would say, I can't put a percentage on it, but a large number of people know in the back of their minds that it just wasn't a straightforward accident. Something went on in Paris that night, which needs to be investigated properly. I think he's been treated unfairly, regardless of what I think about him as a person. I've never met him, so I can't comment. But I think we have tried to interview him on a couple of occasions, but he wouldn't see us, unfortunately. But regardless of what anybody might think of him as a person, he has been treated rather unfairly.
I think so.
And you do have to ask why.
Yes.
What kind of threat does he pose, or is it because of the fact that he's an Arab Muslim?
Yes.
Is there some kind of racist agenda going on, which is racist, going on here?
Well, you mean that, these ancient European, Germanic kind of royal bloodlines, they are, shall we say, suspicious of the Islamic royal bloodlines?
Unquestionably, yeah.
And Diana, again, don't want to retract what we already talked about, but Diana actually going out with an Arab Muslim, an Egyptian Muslim, sorry.
Yes.
Is an up yours to the establishment, big time. I'm not saying that. I mean, I believe she did have feelings. She was seeing a doctor who was a Muslim before she, from Pakistan, I believe, before she took up with Dodi. But obviously, it's gonna roll the establishment. The fact that he's an Arab Muslim, it doesn't make him any different to any other human being, for a start. Yeah.
Yes.
But it's something that it is made something out of by the establishment, because he's an Arab Muslim. Again, we go back to these ancient old battles. The Crusades, the 1300-year-old war against the Christians and Muslims, which in some corners is still being fought.
Yes.
Which just create big problems, and ultimately, it was one of the reasons that led to Diana's death.